In 1984, in the small suburban community of Lynbrook, Long Island, a 16-year-old girl named Theresa Fusco clocked out her shift at Hot Skate's roller rink on a cold November evening. She was young, ordinary in the way teenagers are, caught between childhood and adulthood, eager for the independence her part-time job provided. She never made it home. For nearly 40 years, Theresa's case would become an echo, a name whispered at community gatherings, a missing person whose photograph faded from public memory. 3 innocent men would serve time for a crime they did not commit. Families would fracture under the weight of injustice. But justice, true justice, was not finished with this story. Decades later, in the age of DNA evidence and cold case investigations, a breakthrough would arrive not from eyewitness accounts or detective work, but from an ordinary piece of trash discarded by an ordinary man, a smoothie cup, a single strand of DNA. And finally, after 40 years of silence, answers would come. But to understand how a justice so delayed came to pass, we must first go back to November 10th, 1984, and ask the question that will haunt Long Island for 4 decades. What happened to Theresa Fusco? Before I tell you what happened, comment your country and time below. The autumn of 1984 painted Lynbrook in shades of rust and amber. Long Island suburban streets were lined with split-level homes and manicured lawns, the kind of place where doors were still left unlocked and neighbors knew each other's business. The season had turned cold, that specific New York cold that cuts through fabric and settles in bone. November was approaching its end, and the world beyond these quiet streets was changing. Ronald Reagan was president. MTV had become a cultural force. But in Lynbrook, life moved at its own steady rhythm, measured by school bells and work schedules, by family dinners and Friday night. Theresa Fusco fit into this landscape perfectly. At 16, she carried a particular vulnerability of youth, old enough to work, to drive in some cases, to imagine independence, but still so profoundly young in every way that mattered. She worked at Hot Skate, the roller rink that served as the social heart of Lynbrook for its teenage population. It is also a story about technology, about the power of modern science to read genetic information, to extract meaning from biological traces, to make the invisible visible. The DNA evidence that exists today would have been meaningless in 1984. Theresa's body was examined, evidence was collected, but the technology to read the evidence did not exist. For decades, the biological truth about who had killed her remained locked away, inaccessible to the investigation that needed it most. But the evidence was preserved. Someone, somewhere, made the decision to maintain the biological material, to keep them in climate-controlled storage, to treat them as valuable even though they could not yet be analyzed. And when the technology finally caught up to the evidence, when genetic science reached a sophistication that could read the secrets held in DNA, the preservation of that evidence meant that justice could finally reach across a decade. This is a lesson about the importance of maintaining hope, of refusing to accept false closure, of believing that justice is possible even when decades have passed. The investigators who maintained the cold case file on Theresa Fusco believed that one day something might change. One day, new evidence might emerge. One day, new technology might make old evidence legible. And they were right. They were right to wait. They were right to preserve. They were right to believe that the answer was still out there, encoded in the very matter of crime scene, waiting to be discovered. But the case also teaches us something more troubling, that justice, when it finally arrives, cannot repair what was broken. Theresa Fusco is still dead. The 40 years between her death and her killer's identification cannot be recovered. The 3 innocent men who spent time in prison for a crime they did not commit cannot have those years returned to them. The family who grieved without knowing the truth, who accepted a false resolution, who then learned that resolution was built on error, their suffering cannot be retroactively undone. Justice may come late, but it never vanishes. This is what the case of Theresa Fusco teaches us. The biological trace that Bilodeau left at the crime scene did not vanish. It persisted, waiting in evidence storage, waiting for the technology that would make it speak. The commitment to justice did not vanish. It persisted in the hearts of investigators, in the dedication of cold case unit, in the refusal to accept that some crimes should go unsolved forever. The victim herself does not vanish. Theresa Fusco, 16 years old, working a part-time job at a roller rink on a November night, lives on in the memory of those who knew her, in the case files that bear her name, in the biological evidence that proves her death was not random, but connected to a specific person who can be held accountable. The case reminds us that memory is not merely emotional. Memory is encoded in the very matter of our bodies. Every person leaves traces, biological traces that carry the information of who they are, where they have been, what they have done. In the 21st century, we have learned to read these traces. We have learned that a single cell, a single strand of DNA, can carry enough information to identify a person with near certainty across the entire population of the world. This is a profound development in the history of justice. It means that the invisible can be made visible. It means that the past can speak to the present. It means that crimes committed decades ago can be solved through the application of knowledge that did not exist when the crime was committed, but it also means that we must be vigilant. DNA evidence is powerful, but it is not infallible. Procedures can be compromised. Contamination can occur. Databases can have errors. The interpretation of genetic evidence requires expertise and care. The application of genetic genealogy raises questions about privacy and consent. The excitement about the power of DNA evidence cannot blind us to the reality that the criminal justice system is still operated by human beings, and human beings can make mistakes. The case of Theresa Fusco, in its conclusion, reminds us of what we know but sometimes forget, that behind every cold case, behind every unsolved crime, there are real people. There is a victim who will never age beyond the age at which they died. There is a family that carries the burden of loss across decades. There are investigators who believe in the possibility of justice. There are innocent people who can be convicted by mistake. There are guilty people who can evade accountability for years. And there's always the possibility that truth can emerge from the evidence we preserve, from the commitment we maintain, from the refusal to accept that some questions should remain unanswered forever. Theresa Fusco was 16 years old. She had hopes and dreams that we will never know because she never got to live long enough to pursue them. She had a job that gave her independence and a sense of purpose. She had a family that loved her. She had her whole life ahead of her. And then, on November night in 1984, it ended. For 40 years, the person responsible walked free. For 40 years, her family wondered and grieved and waited. For 40 years, 3 innocent men carried the burden of a crime they did not commit. But finally, in the 21st century, in the age of science and technology, the truth emerged. DNA spoke. Evidence was read. A perpetrator was identified, and justice, delayed by 4 decades but no less real for the delay, began to pursue its course. The case of Theresa Fusco teaches us that justice may be slow, it may be imperfect, it may arrive too late to repair the most fundamental harm, but it persists, it endures, and as long as investigators believe in its possibility, as long as evidence is preserved, as long as families refuse to forget, justice remains a goal worth pursuing, even across the vast expanse of decades, even in the face of heartbreak and loss, even when the ultimate victory can only be a formal acknowledgement of truth rather than a restoration of what was taken. This case reminds us all that the past is never truly past. It lives in memory. It lives in evidence. It lives in the hearts of those who love the victim. And sometimes, when we are patient enough, when we are committed enough, when we preserve carefully and believe persistently, the past speaks, the truth emerges, and the dead, through the evidence they leave behind, finally receive the justice they deserve. Was the kind of place where music echoed off wooden floor, where the air smelled of concession stand, popcorn, and rubber wheels on polished wood. For Theresa, the job was simple work, attending the skate, managing the counter, existing in that liminal space between the adult and teenage world. But it was also her window into autonomy, her first real taste of earning and independence. Her days had developed a rhythm. She would arrive at hot skates before her shift, passing through front doors into that distinctive atmosphere of youth and motion. The place thrummed with energy on weekend, with teenagers gliding across the wooden floor to music that pumped from speakers, their voices rising above the wheel noise and music. Theresa moved through this world with the quiet competence that comes from doing the same job repeatedly. She knew the regular customer. She understood the rhythms of busy nights and slow afternoons. She wore the uniform of hot skate staff, marking herself as part of the operation, as someone with responsibility and purpose. Her co-workers would have known her as reliable, as someone who showed up on time and did her job without drama. She had the particular friendliness that service workers develop, the ability to be pleasant to strangers while maintaining a professional distance. But she was also, fundamentally, still a teenager, someone with a life outside these walls, with school and friends and family obligations, with the internal experiences of adolescence that no job could fully contain or express. Saturday, November 10th, 1984, began like any other Saturday. The weather was cold, the kind of November cold that makes you grateful for jackets and reminds you that winter is coming. Theresa went to work. The details of that specific day have mostly been lost to time, what she wore beyond the necessities, what she ate, what conversations she had with co-workers. These are the small intimacies that vanish when someone disappeared. What we know is that she worked her shift, that she was present and accounted for, that she moved through her job as she always did. As the evening wore on, the roller rink filled with its regular Saturday night crowd. Teenagers arrived with money for admission and skate rental, ready for an evening of entertainment and social interaction. The music played, the wheels rolled across the polished floor, the concession stand did brisk business, and somewhere in this familiar chaos, Theresa counted the minutes toward the end of her shift. Work was work, and even work that you're competent at doing eventually becomes something you want to be finished with. At 9:47 p.m., according to the records that would later be carefully examined, Theresa Fusco clocked out of her shift. She had completed her work. The evening was winding down. Other staff members were moving through closing procedures, and Theresa, having done what she was paid to do, was free to go. She gathered her thing. She left Hot Skate. She stepped out into the November night. The exact circumstances of that departure are largely unknown. Did she leave alone or with someone? Did she mention where she was going? Did anyone see which direction she walked? These questions will be asked and re-asked by investigators, by family members, by anyone seeking to understand the transition from Theresa being alive and accounted for at 9:47 p.m. to Theresa being missing. But the answers, if they existed, were not recorded or have not survived a decade. What we know is a basic fact. She left Hot Skate. She did not arrive home. The distance between Hot Skates and Theresa's home was not impossibly far, not the kind of distance that required a car for a 16-year-old to traverse. It was a kind of neighborhood where teenagers could walk or ride bikes to local businesses and hang out. But between the roller rink and her home lay the November night, dark and cold streets that would have been moderately lit by street lamps, but not filled with people. It was not a dangerous time by the standards of 1984. This was before the hypervigilance about child safety that would develop in subsequent decades, before the era of tracking devices and constant communication. Somewhere in that journey home, something happened. The precise sequence of events remains unknown and may never be fully reconstructed. But somewhere on the streets of Lynbrook, Theresa Fusco encountered someone who would change everything. Whether she knew this person, whether they approached her from hiding, whether she accepted a ride or was forced into one. These details remain locked in the knowledge of a single person and the biological evidence left at the crime scene. What we know is that Theresa did not arrive home. The hours passed, first slowly, as they do when someone is a little late, then with increasing urgency, as the clock moved toward a time that clearly indicated something was wrong. Theresa had been reliable. She had come home from her job before. There was no indication that she had run away. No note, no history of truancy or family conflict. Her absence took on the character of an emergency. The call to Nassau County Police Department would have been made with the particular anguish that comes when a parent suddenly understands that their child is missing, that the reasonable explanations have been exhausted, that something terrible may have happened. The police response was immediate. Nassau County had procedures for missing persons cases. They understood the critical importance of the first hours and days. Detectives began their work. They interviewed family members, seeking to understand Theresa's routine, her friends, any boyfriends or romantic interests, any indication that she'd been in danger or distress. They interviewed her co-workers at Hot Skate, asking about her shift that day, about her demeanor, about whether anyone had made unwanted advances or seemed threatening. They canvassed the neighborhood, talking to residents who might have seen a teenage girl walking late in the evening. They began to construct a timeline and a profile of a missing person. But this was 1984. DNA evidence was not yet a tool that investigators possessed. Fingerprint technology existed, but its applications were limited without suspect information. Forensic science had not yet reached the sophistication that would eventually transform criminal investigation. The police had to work with eyewitness account, with behavioral profiling, with a slow accumulation of leads that might or might not lead anywhere. As days passed without sign of Theresa, the investigation took on a more desperate quality. Volunteers were organized to search wooded areas and drainage ditches where a body might have been discarded. Flyers with Theresa's photograph were distributed throughout the community. Police helicopters scanned the landscape from above. The machinery of search and rescue was activated, driven by the knowledge that if Theresa had been taken by force, the first 72 hours were crucial. But nothing emerged from these efforts. No body was found in the locations that seemed likely. No witness came forward with a clear account of seeing Theresa with a stranger. No tip arrived that pointed to a specific person or location. Theresa had vanished in a way that was almost complete. No phone calls, no ransom demands, no sign that she had run away voluntarily. She had simply ceased to exist in the world of the living, at least in any way that could be documented or discovered. The community of Lynbrook was shaken. The sense of safety that suburban neighborhoods depend on, the belief that predators are rare, that young people can move through their environment without exceptional danger, was fractured. Theresa Fusco had been one of them, had been part of the community, had been walking home from a job that any community would consider normal and appropriate, and she had disappeared. Weeks passed. The active search efforts gradually became less frantic as the likelihood of finding Theresa alive diminished with each day, but the investigation continued. Police pursued leads, followed theories, tried to piece together what had happened, and then, in a development that would provide at least the appearance of resolution, the investigation seemed to find its answer, though, as would be revealed decades later, it was deeply wrong. To disappear is to inflict a particular kind of wound on the people left behind. It is a wound that cannot fully heal because it lacks closure. A death, however tragic, at least provides a fact. The person is gone. Their absence is permanent, and grief can follow its course. But a disappearance leaves a space that cannot be easily filled. The missing person exists in a kind of liminal state. They are gone but not confirmed dead, absent but not definitively lost. The human mind resists this ambiguity. It wants answers. It wants to move from not knowing to knowing, even if what it learns is terrible. For Theresa's family, the years following her disappearance were years of living with that ambiguity. They did not know what had happened to her. They did not know if she was suffering somewhere, if she had been killed quickly or slowly, if she had called out for help in her final moment. They did not know if her body had been found and she was buried in an unmarked grave, or if she remained hidden, undiscovered, slowly being consumed by the processes of nature in some wooded area or waterway. What they did know was that she was gone. That much was certain beyond any doubt. The police had searched. The days had passed. The likelihood that Theresa would be found alive diminished with each passing year. She had been 16 years old when she vanished. If she had somehow been kidnapped and was being held somewhere, she would be aging somewhere. All evidence suggested that this was not the case. The most likely truth, the truth that the family had to learn to accept, was that Theresa was dead. She had been killed on that November night, or very soon after, and she remained dead through all the years that followed. But the family still did not know by whom. The investigation had followed various leads, pursued various theories, but had not produced a clear answer. The absence of resolution meant that the family could not move into a particular kind of peace that comes with understanding. They could only move into a kind of prolonged anguish. The knowledge that their daughter was gone, combined with not knowing what had happened to her, or who was responsible. Then, in 1986, 2 years after Theresa's disappearance, 3 men were arrested and charged with her murder. The news would have reached the family with a kind of complicated relief. Finally, someone was being held accountable. The system was working. Justice was being pursued. But the relief could only ever be partial. The 3 men arrested were strangers to the family. They had no obvious connection to Theresa. They maintained their innocence. And yet, the legal system proceeded as if their guilt was certain. Trials occurred. Evidence was presented. The men were convicted. Sentences were imposed. And the case of Theresa Fusco seemed to have reached its resolution. The newspapers moved on to other stories. The community's acute attention to the case gradually faded. Theresa's family had to contend with the knowledge that someone was in prison for their daughter's murder, that the system had worked, that justice had been done, or at least that was what they were told. But the family still did not have certain answers. They did not know exactly what had happened to Theresa. They did not know where her body was. The convictions provided a kind of formal closure, a legal acknowledgement that their daughter had been killed, that the killers had been punished. But the closure was never complete. It was a closure imposed by the legal system rather than earned through genuine resolution. And then, years later, DNA evidence began to transform criminal justice. The technology that did not exist in 1984, the science that could not be applied to Theresa's case when it might have been most useful, suddenly became available and began to be applied to old cases. The question arose, what would DNA evidence say about the case of Theresa Fusco? In 2003, 19 years after the original convictions, DNA testing exonerated the 3 men. The results were unambiguous. The DNA recovered from the crime scene did not match any of the convicted men. They had been imprisoned, had served years of their sentences, had been convicted of a crime they did not commit, and now they were exonerated, released, their convictions overturned. For Theresa's family, the exoneration was devastating in its own way. The sense of resolution that they had constructed, the story that they had learned to tell about their daughter's death, and the justice that had been served, was revealed to be false. The people in prison for killing Theresa were not the people who had killed her. The real killer had been walking free all this time, unpunished, unaccountable. And the case, which had seemed closed, was suddenly open again. The knowledge that 3 innocent men had been imprisoned for their daughter's murder would have added another layer of pain to the family's grief. Not only had they lost Theresa, but their loss had been used as the basis for a grave miscarriage of justice. Innocent people had been punished, and the guilty person remained unknown. The intervening years from 2003 to 2024 were years of renewed waiting. The case was officially unsolved again. Theresa's file moved into the category of cold cases, cases that were not actively being investigated, but that remained technically open. The community of Lynbrook had largely moved on. People who had been involved in the search for Theresa in 1984 had aged or relocated. The roller rink where she had worked had closed. The world had changed in countless ways, but the case remained unresolved. For Theresa's family, these were years of living with the knowledge that someone had killed their daughter and had never been caught. They aged through their grief, moved through the anniversaries and birthdays, carried the weight of their loss through decades. Every November, the date of her disappearance would return, and with it, the renewed awareness of their daughter's absence. Every year on her birthday, if they remembered it, they would be reminded that she would never age beyond 16 in any meaningful way. She would remain frozen in time, caught in that November night. The family would have found ways to keep her memory alive. They might have maintained a photo or two, might have told her story to younger family members who never knew her. They might have attended anniversaries or participated in cold case discussions if they were invited. But primarily, they would have learned to carry their grief in the way that families do when their loss is not actively acknowledged by the broader world. They learned to live with absence. They learned that justice might never come. They learned to accept that some questions might never be answered. Yet even in this long silence, something was being maintained in the background. Evidence from Theresa's case had been preserved. The materials collected at the scene in 1984, the items that contained the killer's DNA, were stored in proper conditions, maintained in climate-controlled facilities, protected by protocols that understood the value of evidence even when technology could not yet read it. The Nassau County Police Department, like police departments across the country, maintained cold case units. These were investigators who understood that justice does not have an expiration date, that a case from 1984 could potentially be solved in 2024 with the right evidence and the right technology. They understood that DNA evidence could speak across decades, that biological truth could persist even when human memory had faded. The exoneration of the three men in 2003 had been a watershed moment. It had proven that the system made mistakes. It had demonstrated that DNA evidence could overturn conviction, and it had left an unsolved murder, a real killer who remained unidentified. The case became a symbol of what needed to be done to find the actual perpetrator, to ensure that justice was finally truly served. But finding that perpetrator would require either a new lead from a witness or a technological breakthrough. Witnesses, after 20 years, were unlikely to emerge with clear information. Memories fade. People move away. The details that seem important at the time become confused or forgotten. The technological breakthrough, however, was not in the distant future. It was already beginning to materialize. Genetic genealogy was emerging as a new tool for investigators. DNA databases that had been created for genealogical purposes, allowing people to explore their ancestry, were being accessed by law enforcement to identify suspects. The tool had proven effective in cases that had gone unsolved for decades. It worked by taking DNA from a crime scene, extracting a genetic profile, and then searching databases populated by millions of people who had submitted DNA samples for genealogical purposes. From that search, investigators could identify a suspect, could follow family trees, could create a web of possibility. For the Theresa Fusco case, investigators had DNA from the crime scene and years of patience. They had the knowledge that the real killer had never been identified and never been caught. They had preserved evidence and maintained hope. They waited for the technology to advance and the opportunity to arrive. And then, in early 2024, it did. Somewhere, Richard Bilodeau disposed of a smoothie cup and straw. It was garbage, the ordinary detritus of daily life. But that garbage contained his DNA. That DNA was eventually analyzed and uploaded into a genealogical database. Perhaps Bilodeau himself had submitted it, or perhaps a relative of his had submitted DNA, and law enforcement was able to access the genetic information. The specifics of how the DNA was obtained and analyzed matter legally and ethically, but the fundamental point is clear. The DNA was identified, analyzed, and compared to the crime scene evidence from 1984. And then came the match. 40 years after Theresa's death, 40 years after 3 innocent men had been convicted and then exonerated, the technology finally spoke. The DNA recovered from the crime scene in 1984 matched the DNA from Richard Bilodeau. The killer had been identified. In February 2024, the investigation that had been dormant for decades suddenly reactivated. Someone at the Nassau County Police Department received a notification, a DNA match in the Theresa Fusco case. The person who had killed her 40 years earlier had been identified. Richard Bilodeau was 60 years old or thereabouts, a man who lived a full adult life after 1984, a man who had been free while 3 innocent men served time and then were exonerated. He had survived into an age when the technology he could not have imagined in 1984 had finally developed enough to speak the truth about what he had done. The investigation would have proceeded carefully from this point. A match was promising, but not yet proof. Protocols existed to verify DNA evidence, to ensure chain of custody, to rule out contamination or error. Detectives would have examined the records, consulted with laboratories, verified the procedures that had been followed both in 1984 and in 2024. They would have wanted to be absolutely certain before they made an arrest, before they shattered a man's life with an accusation, before they opened the old wound of the Fusco family case. But as the evidence was examined and re-verified, the conclusion became clear. The DNA from the crime scene matched Richard Bilodeau's DNA. The match was not ambiguous. The probability of the DNA belonging to someone other than Bilodeau was infinitesimally small, far beyond the threshold of reasonable doubt. The biological evidence spoke with clarity. Richard Bilodeau had been at the crime scene. His DNA had been left on or in Theresa Fusco's body, or on evidence collected from her. The investigation then branched into multiple directions simultaneously. Detectives worked to understand whether there was any documented connection between Bilodeau and Theresa. They would have examined records, interviewed people who might have known both of them, looked for any indication that they had crossed paths before that fatal night. They would have examined Bilodeau's background, his history, any information that might suggest a pattern of violence or predatory behavior. They would have constructed his timeline for November 10, 1984, looking for gaps that might correspond with Theresa's disappearance. And then, having built their case as thoroughly as they could, they would have made the arrest. Richard Bilodeau was indicted in October 2025 for second-degree murder and murder during rape. The specificity of the charges indicated what the investigation had uncovered. Theresa had not simply been killed. She had been killed in circumstances suggesting sexual violence. The death was not a moment of rage or accident, but an act that appeared to be predatory in nature. Bilodeau entered a plea of not guilty. This was his right, his legal prerogative guaranteed by the Constitution. It meant that the case would not move immediately to sentencing or acceptance of guilt. Instead, it would move toward trial. The evidence would be presented in open court. The DNA testing would be explained to a jury. The procedures that had led to the identification of Bilodeau would be detailed and subject to cross-examination, and a jury would determine, based on the evidence presented to them, whether Bilodeau was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But the indictment itself was significant. For the first time in 40 years, someone specific was being held accountable for Theresa's death. Not three unknowing men, but the man whose DNA had been recovered at the crime scene, the man whose biology had testified across 4 decades to his presence at the moment of her death. For Theresa's family, the moment of indictment would have been powerful and complex. Relief, finally, that someone had been arrested. Anger that it had taken so long. Grief, renewed by the knowledge that the real details of their daughter's death would now be aired in the courtroom. And something else too, perhaps a sense of vindication, of the years of waiting being validated by the knowledge that their loss had not been forgotten, that justice, delayed as it was being pursued. For the community of Lynbrook, the indictment reopened a case that had seemed closed. People who had not thought about Theresa Fusco in years suddenly found themselves thinking about her again, remembering that night in 1984 when a 16-year-old girl vanished and never came home. For the 3 men who had been wrongfully convicted and then exonerated, the indictment was vindication. They had served time for a crime they did not commit. Now, the real perpetrator was being held accountable. The system had failed them, but in the end, it had also corrected itself. Not perfectly, not without tremendous damage, but it had pursued the actual truth. The evidence in the case would rest primarily on the DNA match. Modern DNA testing is extraordinarily reliable. The procedures are standardized. The databases are scrutinized. The probability calculations are based on population genetics. An expert witness would testify about these procedures, about the reliability of the testing, about the statistical improbability of the match being anything other than genuine. The DNA would have to be explained, contextualized, made understandable to a jury that might not be familiar with genetic science. But DNA does not tell the entire story. It proves presence. It proves that Bilodeau was at the scene of the crime, that his genetic material was left on or in Theresa's body or on evidence collected from the scene. It does not necessarily prove how the crime occurred. It does not explain whether Theresa was killed immediately or whether she suffered prolonged assault. It does not explain the exact circumstances of her death or what happened to her body. To construct a narrative that explains these details, investigators would have had to do the work of detective craft, following leads, examining evidence, constructing timeline, developing theories about what happened. They would have looked for evidence of Bilodeau's behavior pattern, for any indication that he had targeted young women before or after 1984. They would have examined the neighborhood where Theresa disappeared, looking for connections to Bilodeau. Did he live nearby? Did he work nearby? Was there any reason he might have been present in the area on that night? The specificity of the charges, murder during rape, indicates that the investigation concluded that Theresa had been subjected to sexual violence before her death. This conclusion would have been based on the examination of her body or the evidence collected from it. The nature of DNA evidence recovered, the location of that evidence, would have informed the understanding of what had occurred. The case would move toward trial with the DNA evidence as the centerpiece. The prosecution would present it, explain it, demonstrate its reliability. The defense would challenge the evidence or offer alternative explanation, working within the constraints of what DNA evidence can and cannot prove. Witnesses might be called, people who had known Bilodeau, people who might testify about his behavior or his whereabouts on the night in question. But ultimately, the jury would have to decide, does the DNA evidence prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Richard Bilodeau killed Theresa Fusco? Did he kill her in circumstances involving rape? Is he guilty of the charges brought against him? The trial would be public. The details of Theresa's death would be discussed, examined, displayed for a courtroom of strangers to witness. Her family would have to listen to the testimony. They would hear about what had been done to their daughter. They would hear described the final moments of her life, or at least the forensic evidence that remained from those moments. And they would watch as the system they had learned to distrust after the wrongful convictions of 3 innocent men now pursued, or failed to pursue, the person actually responsible for their loss. The courtroom is a stage set for justice, but it is also a stage set for the display of tragedy. The trial of Richard Bilodeau would be both. It would be a legal proceeding designed to determine guilt or innocence based on evidence, and it would be an exhibition of grief, of loss, of the consequences of violence, all of it made public, all of it subjected to the rules of evidence and cross-examination. The prosecution would present its case methodically. DNA experts would testify about the procedures followed, the reliability of the testing, the statistical likelihood of a false match. The testimony would be technical, requiring the jury to understand concepts of genetics and molecular biology that most people have never studied. But the ultimate conclusion would be simple. The DNA from Theresa's crime scene matches Richard Bilodeau's DNA. He was present at the scene of her death. His biological trace remains as testimony to his presence. Additional evidence would be presented as available. Details of the crime scene, as discovered in 1984, would be described. The condition of Theresa's body, as documented in autopsies or forensic examinations, would be detailed. The circumstances of her disappearance would be reviewed. The investigation would be laid out for the jury to understand the path that had led from her vanishing in 1984 to Bilodeau's arrest in 2024. Theresa's family would likely testify about who she was, about her life, about the impact of her death on their lives. They would be asked to speak in the past tense about their daughter, to describe her as she was before she was killed. This testimony would serve multiple functions. It would provide the jury with a sense of the victim as a person, not merely as a body or a collection of evidence. It would allow the family to speak to the court about their loss, and it would satisfy a legal requirement that the victim be recognized and honored in the proceeding, even though the victim is no longer present to testify for herself. The defense would work within constraints of the evidence. DNA evidence is powerful, and once a reliable match has been established, there are limited strategies available to challenge it. The defense might argue about the procedures followed, might question the chain of custody, might suggest contamination or error, but with DNA evidence as reliable as this, the defense would be working from a position of severe disadvantage. The focus would likely be on challenging the interpretation of what the DNA proved. Present at the scene does not necessarily prove commission of the crime if there are alternative explanations for present. But in this case, with a victim killed in a manner that suggests predatory violence, with DNA evidence placing Bilodeau at the scene, and with no known innocent reason for him to have been in contact with Theresa's body, the alternative explanations become increasingly implausible. As the trial progresses, as evidence is presented and cross-examined, the jury would move toward a verdict. The question they would need to answer is clear. Has the prosecution proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Richard Bilodeau murdered Theresa Fusco and murdered her during the commission of rape? If the answer is yes, he is guilty of the charges. If the answer is no, he is not guilty, and the jury must acquit him despite the DNA evidence, because the burden of proof remains with the prosecution. The verdict, whenever it comes, will carry meaning both within the courtroom and beyond it. If Bilodeau is convicted, it will represent a conclusion that he is responsible for Theresa's death, that he was predatory, that he committed acts of sexual violence and murder. It will be a formal legal acknowledgement of guilt, a declaration that he should be punished for what he has done. It will provide Theresa's family with the knowledge that the actual perpetrator has been held accountable, that justice has, finally, been served. But the conviction cannot restore Theresa. It cannot give back the decades of her life that she should have lived. It cannot undo the imprisonment of 3 innocent men or repair the damage that wrongful conviction inflicts on families and community. It can only represent a formal finding that the person on trial was responsible for the crime, that he should be held accountable. It is justice, but it is a limited form of justice, delayed by 40 years, delivered in a form that cannot repair the fundamental wrong of Theresa's death. If Bilodeau is acquitted, a scenario that seems unlikely given the strength of the DNA evidence, but that remains theoretically possible, the consequences will be different, but perhaps equally devastating to Theresa's family. An acquittal would mean that despite the DNA match, despite the apparent power of modern science, the jury concluded that guilt had not been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. It would mean that Theresa's family would once again be denied formal justice, would once again be forced to live with the knowledge that her killer walked free. But regardless of the verdict, something significant has already occurred. The case has moved from the realm of unsolved mystery into the realm of justice being actively pursued. The machine of law has reactivated. The victim has been given a voice through the DNA evidence she left behind. The community has been forced to confront the case again, to reckon with the knowledge that predators can move through neighborhoods and that justice can take decades to arrive. For the broader criminal justice system, the case of Theresa Fusco is a case study in both the power and the limitations of DNA evidence. DNA is powerful. It can identify individuals with near certainty. It can speak across decades. It can prove presence at a crime scene. But DNA alone does not solve all cases. It requires competent police investigation. It requires preservation of evidence. It requires that the suspect's DNA be available in a database or recoverable through other means. It requires that the community and the legal system maintain a commitment to pursue justice even when decades have passed. The case also reminds the community of Lynbrook and the broader public of an uncomfortable truth. Predatory violence can come from ordinary seeming people. There is no profile so accurate that it can identify a killer simply by looking. A person who takes a 16-year-old girl's life can appear normal, can move through the world without obvious indication of their nature. This is perhaps the most frightening aspect of violent crime. Not that monsters exist, but that ordinary people, indistinguishable in appearance from anyone else, can be monsters. For the exonerated men, the prosecution of Bilodeau represents a form of vindication. They spent time in prison for a crime they did not commit. They were released when DNA evidence cleared them. Now the person actually responsible for the crime is being held accountable. The system has been corrected, however slowly and however imperfectly. They can know with certainty that they are not guilty and that the real perpetrator is finally facing justice. But this vindication comes at tremendous cost of years of their lives that were stolen, the families that were disrupted, the stigma that attaches to someone once wrongfully convicted. As the legal proceedings continue, as trials are held and verdicts rendered, as appeals are filed and decided, the case of Theresa Fusco will continue to exist in multiple forms. It will be a legal record, a documentation of procedure and evidence and argument. It will be a family's grief, the enduring pain of people who lost someone they loved. It will be a community's memory, the reminder of a tragedy that occurred in their midst. It will be a technological success story, a demonstration of how modern science can solve ancient mysteries. And it will be a cautionary tale, a reminder how justice can be perverted, how innocent people can be imprisoned, and how the guilty can evade accountability for decades. In the end, the case of Theresa Fusco tells us something fundamental about the nature of justice in a world of finite human memory and profound human fallibility. It tells us that truth, even when buried and hidden, persists. It persists in biological evidence, in DNA strands that carry information across decades. It persists in the commitment of investigators who refuse to accept false closure. It persists in the families who continue to grieve, continue to remember, continue to demand answers even when the world moves on. The case of Theresa Fusco is a story about what happens when justice is delayed. It is a story about the consequences of conviction without truth, about the damage inflicted on innocent people when the criminal justice system makes terrible mistakes. It is a story about 3 men who lost years of their lives to imprisonment for a crime they did not commit. It is a story about a family who lost their daughter and then lost their sense of justice being served and then had to wait for nearly 4 decades for the real perpetrator to be identified.